In the year 70 AD, the Second Temple fell. Rome burned Jerusalem to ash. But before the flames devoured everything, a group of scribes carried something out. Not gold, not jewels, a single scroll. They called it heresy. They called it blasphemy. And they swore that if it survived, the world would never forgive them. What was written on that scroll? And why did the blood of a rabbi named Yeshua become the line between salvation and damnation? The story you know is not the story they told. Jesus of Nazareth was not rejected because he performed miracles. He was rejected because he claimed something far more dangerous. He claimed that the law, the Torah, the foundation of everything the Jews believed, was incomplete, that God had more to say, that the covenant could be rewritten. And in doing so, he became the greatest heretic his people had ever seen. To understand why, you must go back, not to Bethlehem, not to the manger, but to the desert, to the hills of Qumran, where the Essenes hid in caves and copied texts no rabbi would dare read aloud. They believed the temple in Jerusalem had been corrupted, that the priesthood had sold itself to Rome, that God had abandoned the altar and would only return when the pure, the chosen, rose to reclaim it. They waited for two messiahs, one a king, one a priest, both anointed by divine fire. Jesus knew these people. Some say he studied with them, others say he rejected them, but one thing is certain. He carried their language. He spoke of the kingdom of God, not as a distant dream, but as an invasion, a rupture, a moment when heaven would tear through earth and everything false would burn. The Pharisees heard this, and they understood what it meant. He was not reforming Judaism. He was declaring it obsolete. You see, the law was everything. It was not just rules. It was identity. It was survival. For 1,000 years, the Jews had been conquered, scattered, enslaved, and the only thing that kept them alive was the law, the Sabbath, the commandments, the dietary codes, the genealogies. These were not suggestions. They were the walls between Israel and oblivion. And now, here comes a carpenter's son from Galilee saying the walls are coming down. That the kingdom belongs not to those who keep the law, but to those who abandon it for something higher. He ate with tax collectors. He touched lepers. He healed on the Sabbath. He forgave sins without sacrifice. And when they asked him by what authority he did these things, he did not point to Moses. He pointed to himself. That was the crime. Not the miracles, not the teachings, the claim, the audacity to say, I am the fulfillment, I am the living Torah, I am the Word made flesh, and if you follow me, you no longer need the temple, you no longer need the priests, you no longer need the law as it was written, because I am the new covenant. Do you see it now? He was not killed for love, he was killed for revolution. But here is where it gets darker. There were texts, secret texts, manuscripts that circulated among early believers. Some called them gospels, others called them lies. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary. These were not fairy tales. They were theological weapons, and in them Jesus says things the church would later erase. He speaks of hidden knowledge, of inner light, of a God who is not above but within. He tells his disciples that the kingdom is not coming in clouds and glory, but is already here, unnoticed, like a seed in the soil. The Jewish authorities feared him because he broke the law, but the early church feared these texts because they broke the story. If Jesus taught secret wisdom, then salvation was not about belief, it was about knowledge, and knowledge cannot be controlled. So they burned the books, they condemned the sects, they rewrote the narrative, and by the 4th century, the heretic had become the Messiah, the revolutionary had become the Lord, and the Jews, the very people who gave him birth, were cast as the villains of the story. But what if that was the lie? What if the real heresy was not what Jesus said, but what was done in his name? The rabbis who condemned him were not monsters. They were protectors. They saw a man unraveling the thread that held their people together. They saw Rome watching. They saw rebellion brewing. And they knew that if this man was not stopped, the temple would fall, the people would scatter, and the covenant would die. They were right. 37 years after his death, Jerusalem burned. The prophecy came true, but not the way anyone expected. The Romans did not destroy the temple because of Jesus. They destroyed it because of zealots, because of rebels who believed the Messiah would come with a sword and drive out the oppressors. These men had heard the whispers, they had seen the signs, and they had misunderstood everything. But Jesus had warned them. He had stood on the Mount of Olives and wept over the city. He had said, "Not one stone will be left upon another." He had told them to flee when they saw the armies coming, and some did. The followers of the way, the early believers, escaped to Pella before the siege began. They survived. But the others, the ones who stayed, the ones who believed God would intervene, they were slaughtered. Over 1 million dead. The temple reduced to rubble, and the covenant, as it had been known for 1,000 years, shattered. The Jews never forgave the Christians for leaving, and the Christians never forgave the Jews for rejecting their Lord. The split became permanent, and in the centuries that followed, that split became violence, persecution, exile, blood. But here is what they do not teach you. Before the split, there were Jewish Christians, thousands of them. They kept the Sabbath, they observed the feasts, they circumcised their sons, and they believed Jesus was the Messiah. Not the end of the law, but its culmination. They called themselves the Ebionites, the poor ones, and they had their own gospel. A gospel that said Jesus was not God. He was a man, a prophet, a teacher chosen by God to bring Israel back to righteousness. The church called them heretics, Rome called them Jews, and by the 4th century they had vanished. Why? Because a new power had risen. Constantine, the emperor who saw a vision of the cross and conquered in its name. He did not convert to Jewish Christianity. He converted to Gentile Christianity, a Christianity without the law, without the Sabbath, without the temple, a Christianity that could rule the world. And under his reign the councils convened, the creeds were written, and the doctrine was sealed. Jesus was not a prophet. He was God, fully divine, eternally begotten, and anyone who said otherwise would be cast out. The Ebionites refused, so they were erased. Their books were burned, their leaders were exiled, and the story of a Jewish Jesus, a Torah-observant Jesus, a Jesus who never claimed to be God, disappeared. But the texts survived, hidden in caves, buried in sand, copied by scribes who believed that one day someone would need to know the truth. In 1945, a shepherd boy in Egypt found a jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices, 52 texts, most of them Gnostic, most of them condemned, and among them was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. No miracles, no resurrection, just words. And in those words a different Christ emerges, a teacher of mysteries, a guide to inner divinity, a man who says the kingdom is inside you and outside you. If you bring forth what is within you, it will save you. If you do not, it will destroy you. This was not the Jesus of Rome. This was not the Jesus of the creeds. This was the Jesus the rabbis feared, the one who taught that God was not distant, not enthroned, not confined to a temple or a law, but present, immediate, dangerous. And if that was true, then everything the priesthood stood for was a cage. Do you understand now? The conflict was never about love versus law. It was about power, about who controlled the story, about who decided what God wanted and how humanity would serve. The Pharisees were not wrong to fear him. He was dismantling their world. And the Romans were not wrong to kill him. He was a threat to order, But the real tragedy is what came after. The revenge, the rewriting, the centuries of hatred justified by theology. The Jews were blamed for deicide, for killing God, as if a man could kill God, as if the divine could be murdered by a mob. And yet, that became the narrative, the curse, the justification for pogroms, expulsions, inquisitions, all because a Jewish teacher said the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong people. But what if he was right? What if the law had become a prison? What if the temple had become a transaction? What if the kingdom he spoke of was not a place, but a reckoning? There is a text, rarely spoken of, the book of Enoch. It was not included in the Hebrew Bible. The rabbis rejected it, but the early Christians revered it. And in it, Enoch walks with angels and is shown the secrets of creation. He sees the watchers, the fallen ones, who came to earth and taught forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astrology, war, seduction. They corrupted humanity, and God sent the flood to cleanse the world. But the knowledge did not die. It passed through the bloodline, through Noah, through his sons, and it waited, hidden, encoded, waiting for someone worthy to unlock it. Jesus quoted Enoch. Not openly, not often, but the echoes are there, the Son of Man, the coming judgment, the separation of the righteous and the wicked. These were Enochian ideas, and they terrified the authorities because they implied something unthinkable, that heaven was not unanimous, that God had enemies, that the divine order itself was fractured. If that was true, then the law was not eternal. It was temporary, a treaty, a boundary drawn after a war. And Jesus, in proclaiming the kingdom, was announcing the end of that treaty, the return of something older, something more primal, something the gods themselves had tried to bury. The Jews did not reject him because they were blind. They rejected him because they saw exactly what he was doing, and they knew what it would cost. They were the gatekeepers, and he was the key that broke the lock. Now the gate is open, and no one knows what walked through. If the gods hid the truth, would you be brave enough to seek it? Or would you, like the priests of old, guard the gate and pray it stays closed? Follow us. The forbidden books are waiting.